Can you help me with that argument? Like, what would be the premises of that particular argument?
Well, the logical problem that I'm thinking of, the sense of evil that we're talking about is all things considered sense of evil. Okay, it's like given everything, right? It shouldn't occur. Okay, I believe, and hopefully you do too, that given everything we know, given everything, the Holocaust is not a good thing; it's an evil thing. It should not occur, all things considered. And to say that, well, though, God might have a morally sufficient reason for permitting it, or more, that would change the calculus, right? If God has a reason for allowing such an event, then it ought to occur given that reason. And so it no longer becomes, in all things considered, evil. So, in other words, the notion of theodicy seems to just be incoherent as a response to the logical problem, because what theodicy does is attempt to explain a reason for why that should have occurred, or that should have been permitted to occur. And so I don't see how that kind of response that that you mentioned, that Plantinga's move there, would be a response.
Probably one key thing to point out is you keep saying like that, it should occur, or God should allow it to occur. But that's too strong. I don't think the theist wants to defend that kind of thing.
What do you think the implications of someone saying I have a morally sufficient reason for permitting or doing X? That morally sufficient reason, right, that's of course a normative phrase, right? The point is that it's something that counts in favor of allowing it or actualizing it.
Yeah, I really don't want to say that. I mean, I understand what you're saying, Danny, and maybe I am saying it if I say that there's a morally sufficient reason.
No,
but I really don't want to say that.
I'm not saying that you're saying that. I'm saying that they're saying that when they say that there is a morally sufficient reason for something that all things considered shouldn't occur. There's some contradiction there.
That is my problem. That is one of my big problems.
I think.
Yeah, if we're saying that it's something that isn't it the same thing to say that it's in all things considered good to say that it should happen? Because I really don't want to say the Holocaust should happen.
Do we find good in normative terms like that? Like, I think you have the situations where it's like, okay, if there was if everyone on Earth would die unless like you did something horrible, like murder an infant, right? I don't think if by that normative definition you ought to murder the child. I don't think you'd say it's a good thing to kill a child in any sort of.
It's good insofar. It's good insofar that it brings about the greater good, right?
Yeah, but it's still evil.
But not in all things considered sense, right? At best, you're going to be a pro tanto evil, and even then, there's a problem.
Sure, but all things considered good can still be evil. You can.
But all things considered good, and all things considered good could be a pro tanto evil, but it couldn't be a pro toto evil.
Right, but I don't know if Blake was maybe he can clarify this. I don't know if he was implying.
But the question, the forceful version of the problem of evil, the sense of evil that's being thought about is the pro tanto sense. The pro toto sense of evil, right? What should or shouldn't occur, all things considered.
Real quick, let me say this. If the response to the evidential problem of evil works out that I just gave, it should trivially respond to the logical problem as I understand it. So, for example, let's go with it. Even I think that Plantinga's like sort of silly responses are enough to handle the logical problem, at least as I'm understanding it. But let's go with my more modest, or excuse me, my harder to defend one. So I just gave a theodicy a moment ago about God allowing evils for a particular reason. What would be your response to that?
I made an argument for why theodicy is incoherent in general when we're discussing about pro toto evil, right? Because the idea is that what theodicy does is attempt to excuse pro toto evil, but you can't excuse pro toto evils because it's all things considered it ought not to occur. There's no fact that would make it that would change that condition, right? Including God's morally sufficient reason. Otherwise, you just got a contradiction.
So, like your example was, given everything, the Holocaust is not a good thing, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. All things considered, the Holocaust ought not to have occurred.
Well, okay, so that's introducing like some trick. Do you need to say it ought not to have occurred, or can we just say it's not a good thing?
That's what I'm saying.
To me, that's synonymous.
No, there's a big difference between whether something is good and whether it's like right or what it ought to be.
Well, there is a distinction between a pro tanto and a pro toto good in the same way there's a difference between pro tanto ought not or ought and a pro toto ought, right? I'm fine with distinguishing those, but again, the relevant sense of evil and good and evil when it comes to a forceful version of the logical problem is the pro toto sense. Because like the idea is that
okay, give me the premise. Let's. I want to write out the premise exactly as you want to word it.
Okay, as far as my argument for why theodicies are going to be an incoherent response to the type of argument I'm running is that the sense of evil that we're dealing with is pro toto evil. All things considered, there are certain things that have occurred that should have not occurred. Okay. Now, what theodicy does is attempt to offer an explanation or reason for why something actually should have occurred. Okay. So you couldn't offer that though if you've already believed that the event in question is a pro toto evil.
Okay, so all things considered, there are things that occurred that should not have occurred. That's premise one. Theodicies assume, we can say, or assert the opposite, that there
is a thing to consider. In other words, there is a thing to consider. You can say it's permissible. It's fine, right? Given some, because there's a morally sufficient reason. The notion of a morally sufficient reason undermines the notion of a pro toto sense of evil.
Yeah, you're saying if there is in fact a reason, like an ultimately good reason, then it's no longer pro toto evil.
Right.
Okay, here's the contradiction. So, like, premise one, all things considered, there are things that occur that should not have occurred.
Mm-hmm.
But if Theodicies for those things are true, then there are things that all things considered that have occurred that all things considered should not have occurred, or excuse me, should have occurred.
Right.
That's the contradiction.
Right. Given the Theodicy is supposed to explain why. Well, it was in fact permissible.
Yeah. So here's my first question. I don't know Christians that say, or defenders of theism that say the Theodicies are things that, if true, about the issues in question, that therefore the so-called evils should have occurred. I don't know anybody saying that they should have occurred. What they're saying in talking about sufficiency is like, here's enough of a reason to allow it.
That's exactly the problem. Enough of a reason, right? That means that it's not too bad to allow.
I'm trying to digest this. I don't quite understand. Can you?
I mean, if we take an example of a vaccine, okay? So the question is, all things considered, what should I do? Get the vaccine? Because I freaking hate needles. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, getting pricked with a needle, we could say, is a pro tanto evil, right? But there's a greater good in mind that I'm going to be immune from the disease, right? So while it's a pro tanto evil, right, it's a pro toto good given the end. The end, I'm going to get immune. So I'm going to tolerate the pro tanto evil because getting pricked for the reason of becoming immune is pro toto good. So that means that getting pricked with a needle in that situation for that end of getting immune is something that cannot be pro toto evil.
So how would we distinguish then between a pro tanto and a pro toto, like empirically? I understand that.
Well, let me hold on, Caleb.
Might show you
Hold on, Caleb. Let me
Okay.
just so I don't lose track here. It sounds like the second premise of the argument says that if Theodicies for things like the Holocaust are true, then all things considered, these things like the Holocaust
are not too bad to allow. Or they're permissible.
should have occurred. But that's so strange. I don't agree that things like the Holocaust should have occurred, and I don't know why I'm committed to saying that.
Well, the point is that if it's, let's say you're doing some kind of greater good theodicy, the point is that given the greater good, it should occur. Just like given to become immune, the end of a vaccine is to become immune, and given that immunity, given that end, what should occur is getting pricked.
Wait a second. So in your view, if something is better, right, then it should occur. Is that an assumption?
I mean, I don't know if that's accurate. Maybe it is. I'm just saying that in the case when you offer some greater good theodicy, for instance, there's an end in mind, and there's something that you've got to tolerate or have got to engage with in order to realize that end. And so, and I give the vaccine case. So, like, if it's the Holocaust, let's say, I know you don't believe this, but let's just pretend, for the sake of argument, suppose the Holocaust will lead to more people entering the kingdom of God, just way down the road, like millions of years later. I don't know. It doesn't matter, right? It's like the vaccine case. The Holocaust would be akin to getting pricked. Okay, because there's a greater good in mind. All these people are going to be saved given that means, which is the Holocaust, right?
Yeah, Danny. I think I've isolated the underlying assumption of this argument because your argument makes complete sense, given the assumption that if something is better, then it should occur. But if you don't have that premise, the argument makes no sense.
Okay, I mean, I would have to think. So if something's better, like it's better to get pricked with a needle for the end than not getting pricked with a needle for the end of getting immune to the disease, but that constitutes a pro toto good, even though it's pro tanto evil. Yeah.
So in other words, the underlying premise is that if something is all things better, then it should occur.
All things can, okay, if it's better, but if it's better than the alternative, then that just means it ought to occur with respect to your alternative choice.
Well, no, because you're introducing an ought there. All we've acknowledged is that it's better.
Better is normative, so it implies an ought.
No, I don't agree with that. I think that.
Well, which one is better, to save the child or drown a child? Well, I would say save the child. That means that when confronted between the two choices, you ought to save the child, not drown them. So better is normative.
No, I don't think that that follows. That sounds more like, I mean, for instance, that seems to assume. Does that assume consequentialism?
No.
Okay, then
you're talking about morality though. So what's better morally should occur, right? I mean, that's not.
No, because we're not talking like when we're talking about like the Holocaust. On the one hand, you're talking about like the occurrence of the Holocaust, and that's not something that God does. So these aren't like competing actions for God to do.
Okay, even if that's true, the point is that it's not too bad to allow. God allows it for some end. And so, at the very least, it's not impermissible.
Reason,
It's
you could just say God permits it, even if He doesn't directly cause it. That it's not bad enough for God to completely stop.
Right, it's not impermissible.
Let me ask this.
I guess
see if it helps like get some clarity here. What do you think about the idea? I'm sure you've heard about the no best worlds stuff. What do you say to people who say the world could always be better?
What do I say to those people? Well, when I say stuff like ideally, this is the ideal case, I'm kind of implying a limitation on my part. Like ideally, I don't have to get up for work, but and I'm just saying like I'm kind of a limited being, and I'm just kind of coerced to getting up for work. If it were up to me and I had all the money and I could snap my fingers and have all the money in the world and be supplied well, then I just wouldn't go to work, right? And so I think
Let
that
me clarify. Sorry, let me clarify just to make sure I'm not wasting your time. So, like some people say, God should have made an all things considered better world, okay, than it is, and they'll give some things that could have been better. The thing is even after you make those changes, there are still ways that things could be better. And then on top of that, there are still, I mean, even if there was no pain and suffering at all, you could still say it was better to start introducing pleasure, and it could still be better to introduce even more and more pleasure. And is it a consequence of your argument that God is obligated
I'm
to do
trying to
all
understand
that?
what you're replying to.
I'm asking you, is it a consequence of your argument that God should always, pretty much, if you can describe a state of the world that's better than it currently is, and God has the power to make it better, then God is obligated to make it better?
Look, I could be wrong about those empirical claims. I think all I need is for someone that the belief that God thinks that there are certain pro toto evils is enough for the problem, right? Now, whether there's in fact, I'm just going to water down the claim. Whether there's in fact pro toto evil or whatever. The point is that it's to believe that God thinks that there's pro toto evil is enough to show that the theist ought to revise.
Mm. It seems to me that at worst they could just bite the bullet and say that to establish, like, what criteria, like if you point to any given evil, what criteria do we establish whether or not it's a pro tanto or
Yeah,
a
that's
pro?
raising the epistemic
Exactly,
question.
that's the epistemic question.
It's saying you're begging the question. I could concede your point and say there are no pro toto evils, there may be pro tantos, but the burden of proof would be so ridiculously high to establish that and this is what you'd be a little bit of a divine skepticism.
Yeah, I mean, look, again, like when Mackey presented, and I'm not presenting Mackey's argument, but in the 55 paper, Evil and Impotence, right? Mackey says, look, if you don't think that there's evil, this argument doesn't apply. And evil in the sense that he was talking about. In the same way, I'm going to say, if you don't think there's pro tanto evil, then the argument is just not going to demand you to revise.
Do you mean pro toto?
Did I say pro toto? Okay, I'm
You
going to
said
say
pro
pro
toto.
toto.
Real quick, guys. I just want to say, Blake, and I super appreciate this. So there won't be any more people coming up on stage. I mean, we're maxed out, and I just want to make sure you're cool with it. Blake, I think the input is helpful because we're really trying to come to a conclusion here. I think Caleb's offered good stuff, and Danny is also. This point has been an issue here on Clubhouse. This is something Jack talks about. Danny obviously talks about this being an issue here on the pro tanto issue, and I think we're getting to the heart of it. So I hope we can really drive to where we actually have some sort of resolution here. I really appreciate it. Are you okay, Blake? Are you okay with what's happening right here, or do you want to shift it? Are you okay with the direction we're going?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think I see what Caleb's doing here, and I think he's right. It's I don't most theists, like, at least they're probably going to say they think the world is on the whole good as it is, and if you want to say the world is on the whole bad as a result of the Holocaust, that there's or that it's a pro tanto or pro toto bad. I don't usually use those words, and all things considered bad. Then yeah, it's going to be, you can really play skeptical theist there and say, kind of do the stuff that William Lane Craig does, butterfly effect and all that junk to say it's really hard to.
I want to ask a question though.
Real quick, but that wasn't the direction I was going. That wasn't the direction I was going.
I agree with Caleb. There could be, in fact, I actually do agree with Caleb that if there's a big epistemic problem in knowing what in fact is good or evil in the pro toto sense, but all I'm satisfied with is or all I want to make claims about is belief revision. That if you believe X and you believe Y, you believe Z, then there's a demand for revision given certain epistemic commitments to logic or whatever, right? And I'm fine with that. I could just totally be fine with the fact that, like, there's a epistemic issue on even if there was a deity like God or God, So I'm just saying that if you believe that there's a pro toto sense of evil and you believe that God has these set of properties, then I think there's going to be an incompatibility with invoking a theodicy.
Right. And that's, I think, part of semantics, but that's fair. But all I would say, like, I would just contend, and I think you're right about the epistemic issue, is that I think well, I shouldn't say your position because that's not what you're defending, but someone who would espouse the, like, pro toto evils, I would say their view is very hard to falsify when we're doing theory comparison. Whereas I can give you examples where, like, if such evils existed, it would virtually falsify theism for me. Like, if you were to show a world in which there was horrible suffering and no afterlife, or a world in which there was horrible suffering and people had their memories wiped every 5 minutes to where they could never virtually develop virtues, those would be the kinds of evil that I think would definitely falsify
Now,
theism.
Caleb, there is, while, look, I think that, I mean, I'm just confused because of sin, right? Like, I mean, presumably, at least when I went to church, when I wasn't a heathen, right? I was told that certain actions you should not do, right? You should obey God, and it was an action guiding sense. It wasn't the sense where, like, God wants you to not do this, all things considered, right? That was the implication. It wasn't like because when I'm asking as a Christian, God, what should I do? And when God reveals the answer, that's what He wants you to do, given everything. And so to be skeptical about pro toto goods and pro toto evils is to be skeptical to the question or that you might ask God, what should I do?
Right. And I think again, it's a range, right? Where, like, there are things that you should and shouldn't do. And ultimately, I think God can make it work with whatever you give him. But there are better examples. Like, I like to think of it like you have a dice and you're rolling a board game. Every roll you make, you get to move across the board, but you'd rather roll a 6 than a 1, right? So if someone is in pain, right, the good thing for me that I ought to do is to go help them and to nurture them. I could ignore them, which would be, let's say helping them would be a 6, ignoring them would be like a 3, and then, like, actively going and harming them even more would be like a 1. Like, that's something we don't want to do. I think with whatever outcome happens, it's not a pro tanto. I'm sorry, a pro toto. Yeah, I get that. It's not a pro
really, like, I'd be
from that.
surprised, Caleb. Can we use a
But-
Bible story? Like, do you think that Moses, all things considered, should have obeyed God in when he was a burning bush to go to Pharaoh and demand that to let his people go?
Yes, but if he didn't,
Okay.
then it still would have. I think it still could have worked out in different ways. I don't think it's a one option, like it has to be this way. So like God may have not wanted the Holocaust to happen, but it wasn't so bad to where like he wouldn't have permitted
Okay.
it.
Well, look. Now what I'm hearing is that it seems like no matter what action Moses took,
Right.
whether he chose to obey the burning bush or not, or disobey,
As I win, tails you lose.
Yes,
Yeah.
but there's an easy way and a hard way. You can win the game fast by rolling all sixes. You can do it really, really slow by doing all ones. You can do something in between. So there's an easy way and a hard way, a narrow path and a short path. We're all going to get there at the end, but some of us make it way more complicated than we need to.
But what it sounds like is that whatever action Moses take, there's not a sense in which it was where he would think to himself, well, that was a mistake, or God wouldn't be able to say that was a mistake. Everything that occurs, all things considered, ought to have occurred, or that the alternative was just as permissible. Either one, and that is just not how I understand how many theists and these Semitic religions think about sin and think about what these Bible stories, right? That what's his name? Jonah really did make a mistake when he ignored God's commands. That he should have done otherwise, all things considered, given that God commanded him to do otherwise.
Right. Yeah, and yet God still used that to work it out, and we've got the story of Jonah, which would not
Well,
have been
but
the same
Jonah,
if God called.
yeah, I don't understand. I mean, to Blake and to Caleb.
You're cutting out, AP. I think it's something on his end if he thinks we're roboting.
Real quick, can I get clarification from you? Because it sounds like Caleb's talking about one thing.
Oh,
I
sorry.
think
Go
what
ahead.
Caleb is trying to say. Go ahead, Caleb. You represent yourself.
No,
Sorry.
go ahead, Blake. I finish what you're going to say.
It sounds like one of you is talking about like what Moses should do, and the other one of you is concerned about like how the world ends up based on what he does. And I was thinking that Christians tended to be more deontological in terms of what we should do, and God is a little more consequentialist in terms of what we would expect him to do. So Moses, he gets commanded to do something, and if our obligations come, right on God's commands, then that's the end of the story there.
Okay, but I guess the question for me is God indifferent to what Moses chooses to do? Because his ends will be realized either way.
I don't think he's indifferent, like as in he doesn't care. I think he would prefer it, but he's not going to intervene to make it happen that way. Maybe is a better way of saying it, or at least in that it's not bad enough to where he needs to require it to be that way.
Yeah, well said. I agree with
Yeah,
that.
but then you're just talking about a non-normative notion of the good.
Yeah, which we had this conversation pretty often, Jack.
Can I? Yeah, because this is the start of discussion. Like, let me ask you this. Like you said earlier, well, no sane Christian would argue. I think you're right. That the Holocaust ought to have happened. But we all know a particular insane Christian, I think, who does argue that. So if this insane Christian comes up to you and says, God wanted the Holocaust to happen, therefore I'm glad that it happened and praise God, why is he wrong? Why is that a wrong thing to say? Because it seems to me what you're saying is consistent with what he's saying. Yeah.
Well, I mean, that would be one of those things like where I would say, well, that's obviously not God. That would be really good evidence.
Okay, but why?
That,
Why? I understand what you're saying, but why? Why is he wrong? Because from what you're saying, this idea of this all things considered good, isn't it the same thing as saying it's God's will and that therefore should be done? And then are we then saying praise God it happened? I mean, I think that's really, really wrong. I think that's really, 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 really wrong. I don't want to say that.
Well, to the degree that you're,
why do you think he's wrong?
To the degree that we're both confident that God wouldn't like see to it that the Holocaust happens, like that he, in the sense that he wants it to happen and doesn't have an overarching reason for it because it's on the whole bad. Insofar as you think that it is on the whole bad, you would just think that God would never bring it about or would never allow for it.
Except that
never
he
bring it
did.
about.
Except that he did.
But in the
Except that he
normative
did,
sense,
right?
in the normative sense, it's an all things considered good, right?
No, real quick, AP. No, the presumption is that it's not on the whole good. Or excuse me, I actually lost myself.
No, it has to be.
Sorry.
It has to be in all things considered good normatively if God is omnipotent.
It is in all things considered
And
good, but you
perfectly
can have
good.
different ranges of that. You can have even better goods and
No,
even worse.
no,
goods.
you can't. You can't. Not if God is perfectly rational and all powerful, right? He's got to choose the better of the two options. If he's
But some of
perfectly
that is
rational.
understanding.
Caleb, I would agree with you if we're talking about humans. But... Sorry, Jack, go ahead.
No, it is because, well, yeah, Jack can finish what he wants to say if he wants.
No, let's go ahead, Danny. I'm sorry.
Oh, he's cutting out.
No, like, yeah, like
I kind of want to like return to the bases, and if we're going to make an argument, we need premises, and then we need to defend. We need to like have sub arguments to defend the premises, so that we're not talking past each other.
Yes. I think that's great because we do. This is really the crucial thing. It's one of the major.
Yeah,
reasons
I'm not good at that. I'm sorry.
This is one of the major reasons he came on, Blake. In my view, I was hoping we could resolve because this has really been a contentious point here. So yeah, Danny, do you think maybe you could lay it out in premises,
Well,
could you do that?
Let's just start. We have to start with some givens. The argument won't work if you don't accept these, or if you don't believe these things. They won't apply to you, I should say. Do we believe that God believes that there are certain events that have occurred that ought not to have occurred, not to have occurred, all things considered? Do the theists in the room believe that God believes that?
Do we really need to like frame this in terms of God's belief? Can't we just like speak factually? Like,
but this is but look, it's an internal critique, right? If you're someone that thinks that there's a Star Wars universe, right? I'm criticizing the Star Wars universe. I got to start with the kind of truths about Star Wars, right? In the same way, I mean, I'm not to be insulting. I love Star Wars, but the idea is that there's a problem, an internal problem here, as I see it, and the internal problem occurs when theists accept these premises or have these beliefs. Because it might be. I mean, I would have to. It might. I mean,
But I mean,
I don't.
propositions about what God believes would be just as bad, right? Because that would be Star Wars all the more. Because then you're saying God exists.
No, I'm just saying that. Look, I'm saying that these commitments or these beliefs are incompatible, and I think that most theists hold to these beliefs. Now, there might be a theist out there that doesn't think that God is omnipotent, which I don't think the argument applies to them. There's not going to be a problem,
Omnipotent or
right?
omniscient? I agree.
Huh?
Omnipotent, because I mean, I'm privy to open theism. I'm not necessarily there. I think Molinism is also possible. I go back and forth between the two. But even then, I don't really think that. I think I can say that ultimately, the world in which we have there's not any evil that is bad enough for God to not permit. However, that doesn't mean that this is necessarily the ideal way God wished it came about, given human freedom. But the human freedom falls within what God permits. So
I hear you, Caleb, and I want to jump to that honestly because I think that's something that does need to be addressed because. I think now here's my claim, and I got to support it. But
guys, hold on, please. I'm begging you. Let's start from scratch because I can tell. Okay, but here's the thing: I can tell.
I felt at some point, Caleb. Right. So what you said is how I felt.
Hold on, Danny. Hold on, Danny. Hold on, buddy. Just a second. I promise. Look, here's the deal. I mean, I want to uphold my commitments to Blake, and I'm giving him kind of the driver's seat on where he wants to go here.
Okay,
so
yeah, I want to get to what you're going to, Danny.
Wait, Blake. I want to know what the all things considered good here.
No, you're going too far too fast because I can tell y'all have been having this conversation, and you're even a little ahead of me. But for me and everyone in the room. It would really behoove us to write down the actual premises.
But that's the point. Is that the all things considered good thing to do here and right now, right?
Don't ask me questions. I want to help you. Let's work together. Maybe Caleb can do it if you don't feel comfortable writing out an argument. Caleb,
I think you misunderstood me, Blake. I was kind of
can you go through what we have to accept, though, Danny? Because maybe that will help. Because you're starting to say, do theists accept this? Like, oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I think there's a problem.
Are you good with that, Blake? Is that what you?
Andrew, you're roboting.
Blake, is that what you want to do for Danny to? Okay, Blake, do you want Danny to go through with what we need to accept?
I think Caleb has a grasp of what he's doing, and maybe Caleb can help formulate actual premises that we can put down, and then we can all be on the same page.
But the premise, I'm making the claim that the argument does not apply to people that don't accept these propositions.
That's fine. You can make a premise that I'll ultimately reject, but at least it's there.
I think Danny and I are somewhat on the same page with a lot of this. Maybe not to the ending of it, but
yeah, I think so.
I think he understands where I'm.
I know I'm telling you guys, it's going to do a world of wonders, though. And you're right, Danny, that there might be a premise that someone's going to reject. That's fine. But you can still talk about the argument at that point.
No, the argument is that there's a problem with these beliefs together. You can't hold to the conjunction of these beliefs and be rational. That's the argument.
Okay, then what you do is you say assume X, for contradiction.
Yeah. So assume that the theist believes that God thinks that there are all things considered evils. Okay. So that the theist believes that these all things considered evils have good explanations for their permissibility.
Okay, so we're assuming two things here. Assume that God thinks there are all things considered evils, and then what does the theist think?
If that is incompatible with the belief that God has morally sufficient reasons or for permitting.
It's incompatible with God. God has what?
God having morally sufficient reasons for permitting, or even I should say actualizing. That's probably the better word. God has morally sufficient reasons for actualizing pro-toto evils. Sorry, pro-toto evils.
Actualizing the world.
Okay. So let me read these. So we're assume that God thinks that there are all things considered evils, and then we can say if the assumption is true, then God has morally sufficient reasons. Would that be how we do it?
No, I'm saying that is incompatible with the belief that God has morally sufficient reasons for actualizing the events that he thinks that are pro-toto evil.
Okay, so if God thinks there are all things considered evils, then this is incompatible with the Christian worldview that there basically aren't all things considered evils.
Yeah, because the idea is that if God has a good reason for actualizing a pro-toto, an event, then it's not pro-toto evil. Yeah. These are the two beliefs that I think are at the heart of it for me.
Like to give you like an example, if I can piggyback off of Danny, as far as I understand, like if you're going to say that, let's say that a man rapes a woman and you're going to say, okay, God gave that person free will, then in that case you would say that God giving that person free will and not intervening is overall a good thing, and it's better for God to not intervene and to get that person free will, even if he uses it to harm someone, than it is for him to have prevented that. So, all in all, it is technically a good, even if we would say, it ought to have happened in terms of God ought to have given the opportunity, ought to have given that freedom without intervening, even if you wouldn't say the act itself was a good thing. Does that make sense? Danny might agree with that in terms of
that went quick, but it does sound like somewhere in our argument we're actually going to need to affirm that if something is like a better state of affairs, then it's what God ought to make the case. It's what God ought to actualize.
Right.
That's a premise that theists almost unanimously. In fact, like every theist philosopher I know denies the premise that if something's better than God, ought to actualize it.
Wait, no, look, if X is better than not X, then X ought to be actualized.
No, where are you getting ought? That's a weird way of ought.
Again, the notion of better. Wait, I'll just ask you.
That's
Is
strange.
it better to drown a child or to save a child?
Do you notice that you're switching ontological categories? Like there's a category mistake here because you're switching between like the goodness of states and then what I ought to do to realize those states.
Okay,
Those
fine.
are two different.
I don't think that's going to make a difference. I can just change the language, right? Do you think the event actualized where a child is drowning is better than the event that's brought about where the child is being saved?
Let's say all things considered. Use your all things considered language.
No, that's the question. I'm trying to show you the sense of better as to demonstrate that it implies what ought to occur. So
well, are you talking about all things better when you talk about the child drowning?
I'm asking you, do you understand the question?
Yeah, but my answer is going to be contingent on whether it's an all things considered or not.
If someone on the street asked you that question, how would you respond?
The same way. I need to know the context because I can imagine scenarios where all things considered it could be better, but that doesn't mean that doesn't mean there's an ought attached to it.
Okay, so let's use a concrete example. All right, do you know Corrie ten Boom? Okay, she was a Holocaust survivor. Her sister died, unfortunately, because they in the camps because they were hiding Jews. Okay, and it was very sad because she survived and her sister did not, and she just saw her sister starve away and die from, I think it was some typhus or something or whatever. Typhus. Okay. Anyway, so I'm gonna ask you, Blake. That's what occurred. Okay. Now, Blake, would it have been better that Corrie ten Boom's sister would have lived along with Corrie?
I don't know. I really don't. I mean, it seems like, huh? What?
A little bizarre to me.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine goods that can come out of that would outweigh it.
Okay, so is there anything that you think is any event that's better than some other, the negation of that event? Is there anything that you believe?
You mean in a pro tanto or a pro toto sense? Is there?
In any sense. At this point, now I'm wondering how you're interpreting it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you just gave a pro tanto sense, and I mean, in a pro tanto, it's better to save a child. That's drowning.
Okay, so is there a pro toto sense of better? That anything that's just all things considered is better than some other event? Anything?
Oh yeah, I'm positive there is because I think that God can make the world better.
Okay, so now I'm seeing. So now the notion of better that I was using earlier was the pro toto sense. Yep. All right, so it does imply an ought.
No, it doesn't imply an ought.
Like, how would God make the world better in your mind? What would that look like when you say that?
One more happy baby to the world.
Okay, but I guess I'm thinking, like, do you think the world we live in where people have, I know you're monist, where people have free will and they can go closer to God, isn't that a good world that we live in a world in which God wants? Even if it has evil entailed? So, okay, do you think that God continues to create after a certain, like, do you think God, because if you think God's eternally creating, then you will always get, one more happy baby at some point, right?
Yeah, but I mean, God could make things better now. So overall, the idea is that the way things that are now, they could be better now and could be increasingly better. Basically, I'm affirming the no best. I'm affirming the no best worlds thesis. The world could always be better.
Well, I agree that
God has an obligation to make things better.
But there's categories of worlds, though, right? Like I agree with you that God can always make one more, and I think that I actually would say God probably has a creation where that will always continue to get better. It'll never get to that infinity because you can't, but it'll always be a potential infinite, right? I'd say that's the world we live in, and there are worlds in which God. Do you agree that there are worlds in which God would not create? Like, would God create a world in which people only were tortured and could never become better people out of that torture? Like, God would not create that world, or would you say, well, there's no possible world, so they're all.
Sorry, hold on, you're gonna have to repeat that. My Alexa's yelling at me, reminding me to send my tax forms. It's the last day.
Oh, no.
I complete.
Stupid tax day.
I know. I finished it. I just have to recheck it.
I work in state government. I know all that people hate taxes.
Okay,
anyway.
maybe Blake, I have a question. Do you think it's better for someone to obey God or disobey God?
That probably obey. That's an interesting question. I'd have to think. I haven't thought about that question before, but it's certainly right for them to do it. But I don't know if it's better. Like that question would be like what makes that interestingly unique is it's like God is omniscient, and the question is, is it possible for a perfectly good God to command someone to do something that would result in a world that's not overall better? Maybe it could, for instance, if God knows the person will disobey, and that will result in an overall better world. So I think it's possible.
All I'm trying to get at is that what does it mean to say, yeah, it's better to obey God than disobey God, but it's not. Nonetheless, that what ought to have occurred, but nonetheless, it's not true that it ought to that obedience ought to occur over disobedience. I don't know what that. If it doesn't mean that, then I really think we're abusing the term better here.
No, I guess I'm not following you there. I think that we have obligations which fall out of God's commands. And I think that's what we ought to do is a different question than what is better. Better has to do with the ontology of things. There's a difference between obligation talk and how am I?
When we say greatest value, when we say better, that's usually what I mean by the world with the most value. And
a better state of affairs. Yeah, that's right. You can talk about that's right.
Valuable state of affairs.
And axiology. Yeah, that's axiology. So right, when we talk about better in a better world, that is completely separate. Unless you're like a consequentialist, that is completely separate from what obligations are.
If God existed and I could talk to God, like I could talk to Jesus or something like that, and I said, Jesus, I don't know what to do here. Should I be a physician or lawyer? Which one is better? That's what I'm asking. I'm asking Jesus, which one is better?
Are you talking about better for you?
I want all things considered.
Do you mean which one do you want for me to do?
Look, do you think Jesus would be puzzled at the
I
question?
don't understand why this is so hard.
But he's
Yeah,
saying, is it
I don't
arbitrary on what Jesus is just saying? Let's draw it out of hat. Okay, it'll be a physician, or like, does God have a reason that like he can bring it? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, is God just arbitrarily picking like, yeah, he can be a physician, why not over law? Or does God have
No,
like a good
that's not.
reason
I'm
for
just
saying
getting
this?
at the meaning of better. I'm just saying that the way I think Jesus would interpret me is like, hey, Jesus, what is better? I'm deciding, right? What's better,
Yeah.
a doctor or a
Yeah,
lawyer?
results in a better world. Let's say that. That's what I think you mean.
Yeah, Jesus even uses
I'm just
himself when
saying.
he says, "Is it better for you to give your son a snake instead of bread, or something like that?" Right? Like, I think Jesus understood this concept pretty well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and so
just
the question is, if that sense is divorced from the question, Jesus, what is the good here, or what should be done, or what should be here, then I really think you've isolated yourself from how the term is being used in most contexts.
let me back up. Give me some time here to develop a thought for you. Okay. Well, real quick, are you familiar with supererogatory goods?
Unfortunately,
Okay. So supererogatory goods, as you know, are goods that are things that you aren't obligated to do, but nevertheless are good to do. So, for instance, a surgeon, right? Let's say he does some pro bono work for someone. He's not obligated to do that for free, but nevertheless, it's good for him to do. Most pro bono work is good, but not obligatory. Okay. So when we talk about like my relationship to God, a lot of the things that God wants me to do, I'm obligated to do. For instance, I'm obligated not to sin. I'm obligated to not lie. Okay. On the other hand, if I'm praying to God and saying, God, should I be a lawyer or a surgeon? I'm not asking God, which one of these am I obligated to do? I'm asking which one is
what I
better.
am asking.
Hold on, let me finish, please. Let me finish.
That's what-
You can correct me later. I'm asking which one, would please you most, and I would interpret that as which would make for a better world. And then I would expect God to tell me no, which one is better, but that doesn't mean I'm obligated to do the one
You
that
would be
God gave
obligated.
me.
Based off of what though?
Hold on.
You'd be obligated if you want to please God.
All right, try to let him finish too when he's talking, guys. I appreciate
What's
it.
the basis for it being better though? Like, again, without it just being arbitrary, why is it better for God to tell you to be a physician than a lawyer? Like,
I'm stipulating that God has a reason for saying that it's better. For instance, it'll result in one extra person coming to be saved.
Okay, so then we would say that saving people is like the value making state of affairs that we would want to actualize, right?
Yeah.
Right, and so if you can choose between a state of affairs that has more value over another, then you ought to choose that
No,
higher state of
I
affairs.
completely reject that premise. That's like the supererogatory thing. Just because it's better doesn't mean it's an
But then
obligation.
the sense of good that you're talking about is the non-action guiding sense of good. It's not a sense of good that sort of helps us answer the question, what should I do? Or what should ultimately be?